Welcome back, Bowling Green, to tonight's Revolution 91.7 Platform Report. I'm Hattie Baji. Earlier in the show, Marquise Alexander opened discussion on expanding events of Black History Month throughout the year. Along with this, there is another aspect of our society America should also encourage. Within the last decade, the United States has made numerous efforts in spreading the importance of America's youth to take part in math and science so that we can successfully compete with the global economy and the world. However, a certain group has been underrepresented in this area, America's minority students. Lately, America has faced a rigorous challenge to foster inclusion of this group. WKU reporter Marquise Alexander has more on this issue.
Despite the multiple steps the United States has taken since the 1970s to give minority students a sense of community in the arenas of math and science, there has been a remarkable lack of progress in the past 40 years. According to the Huffington Post, many math and science minority undergraduate students report problems of lack of preparation, stereotyping, and unsupportive learning environments as three major challenges they face with math, science, and math. WKU African-American pre-med student Latea Williams says her journey has been no simple task.
Being in the pre-med program has definitely brought its challenges. I've been taking honors, science, and math classes since I was in elementary school, and looking around the class, there weren't a lot of kids who looked like me. It was predominantly white males. It didn't make it harder for me to do the work. It just would have been more encouraging to see people who looked like I did. My dad's been really encouraging, though, because he himself is a doctor, and working in the field, he knows there's not a lot of African-American males, let alone African-American women, and so he's been really supportive in this process for me, which is nice to have.
As the Chronicle observes, experts across the country warn that if America truly wants to get more of the nation in math and science, it has to help its minority youth to not fall through the cracks. For Revolution 91.7, I'm Marquise Alexander.
Thank you, Marquise, for that report. Joining me tonight to continue our discussion about the lack of math and science studies amongst America's minority youth is Hispanic student Christina Madero, an honored WKU pre-med undergraduate. Thank you for being with us today, Christina.
Of course, I'm happy to be here.
Thank you. Christina, you're a pre-med student here at WKU. What is the story behind your career at the university? How did you end up as a Hilltopper?
Well, I actually went to high school in South Florida at Nova High School, and I started doing speech and debate there because doing forensics looks really good on a application to college. And as many people know, at WKU, we have a very prominent forensics team on campus, and I really loved forensics when I started doing it in high school, and I decided to apply here, and they allowed me to come here, and it was just another stepping stone in my ultimate goal.
So you came here in mind that you wanted to do pre-med?
Absolutely.
Everybody has that one career they want to do. When I grew up, I want to be blank. What was that one thing you wanted to do when you grew up?
Well, the first thing I ever wanted to be growing up was a fashion designer. And I watched all of the reality TV shows, What Not to Wear. And then when I started going to school, I really loved math and science. So I decided to combine my steady hands with what I really loved to learn about. And I figured pursuing a surgeon, it was what I wanted to do. So that's what I've been doing thus far.
So you started your love of math and science in high school. So your high school, did it have a good program for you, in your personal opinions, for you to do that?
Yes, my high school was very good with math and science, thankfully. Again, I went to South Florida, and the school that I went to, it was a public school, but it was so difficult to get into that when I was born, as soon as my mother knew what my name was going to be, she immediately filled out that application so I could get into that school. And it was luckily that I did, because the neighborhood school that I would have went to, my life would have been completely different.
That's great. So you had good inspiration from your school. Now, a couple of years later, you're a college student, you're a pre-med student, honors program. Are you a first-generation college student? Did you have that support from home to help carry you throughout your college career?
My parents were always very supportive, always pushed me to achieve whatever goal I set for myself. They allowed me to do so. But the most difficult thing about trying to get into college was, my father only has his GED, and my mom went to community college for less than a year, only a few months, because she couldn't afford to keep going. So I'm basically going to be the first generation person to actually graduate from college. And the most difficult part was trying to figure out exactly what I needed to do, what steps I needed to take, because my parents didn't know. Thankfully, a lot of the advisors in high school and a lot of the advisors I've met here at WKU have been very helpful.
Well, that's great. You've had that helpful stance to help carry you through this. Pre-med, that's a lot of science. How's your collegiate journey as a pre-medical student been here, coming from your background and where you've come from your past?
The sciences, they're getting more difficult. I'm a junior now, so they're becoming more studious, and I'm having to put in a lot more hours of studying. In high school, I was always very good. I understood the material very quickly. And just knowing going into a pre-med degree and trying to figure out what exactly I need to learn, what exactly I need to know to take the MCAT to get into medical school, all of those things compiling up. And what I love about the sciences and math is you don't just memorize a fact and then forget about it. Everything you learn builds on top of each other. You're able to make all these connections to things you've learned previously.
Great. So you can build those connections. Given what you have learned in college and from your experience in high school, have you faced any problems specifically being a minority in your study, whether from high school to college now?
I've had a few difficulties. When in my senior year in high school, I took a lot of AP classes, and one of my teachers was asking everybody, what do you want to be when you go to college? What do you want to do? And when she got to me, I was like, I want to be a surgeon. She just looked at me with this confused look, and she's like, well, we can't all be doctors now, can we? Wow. And what I love more than anything is proving people wrong. So that whenever I've been talked about for being a minority or underestimated because of that, it just pushes me harder to overcome it. And even in coming to Western Kentucky from South Florida was a very big culture shift for me. South Florida is very diverse. Bowling Green, Kentucky is not so much. And it's not so much of, rudeness or anything. I think it's more of an ignorance. They just don't understand different cultures, different minorities. In many of my classes, some of the students interchangeably use Mexican with Hispanics when they don't understand Hispanics. There are like 30 different countries that represent that whole group. So it's a little derogatory. They don't understand it, though, so it's easy to forgive. Easy mistakes.
So you've had experiences from your teacher. In general, peers can influence the way that we view ourselves quite often. Have you had any negative or positive experiences with your peers saying, hey, I want to be a doctor, even though they might not be the culturally thing to do, that a lot of people do, maybe your culture or people that are like you?
Well, for me, coming from a Hispanic culture, Puerto Rican specifically, it's very male dominated, where the women are supposed to be submissive and, you get married, you pop out a few kids, and then that's it. So trying to combat that has been difficult, mostly because my father's very traditional and conservative. And although he is proud of me, there's like this part of him, he's like, so who are you dating? When are you going to get married? I'm like, Dad, I don't have a job yet. Relax. So it's been a journey, and really, it's, you started from the bottom, now you're here.
Well, that's great. You've definitely got to that top level,
yes.
Almost done here. Again, for all you Revolution listeners, I'm Hattie Baji here with pre-med student Christina Madero. After the break, we will have a discussion on possible things for America to think about in combating this issue.
Remember when your neighbor found us naked in the car, and the time some outdoor action got us kicked out of the park? Getting frisky in the dark, I gave your eye a poke. I think the dog is also in the bed. Do I smell smoke, you and me? We never, ever, ever give up.
You didn't give up on sex. Don't give up on birth control either. There are more methods than you think. Visit bedsider.org to compare all the choices. Brought to you by Bedsider and the Ad Council.
Me, a cat, moving in with a single guy. At first, I thought it might be a little weird, but turns out it's actually pretty amusing. For instance, like my human's gotten so used to me being around, sometimes I think he forgets I'm here. He'll get up for work, shower, shave, and come out with no pants. Plops right down in front of the TV. Hello, there's a lady in the room.
A person is the best thing to happen to a shelter pet. Be that person. Adopt. Brought to you by the Ad Council and the ShelterPetProject.org.
Welcome back to all of you tuning in to Revolution 91.7. I'm Hattie Baji, back here today with minority pre-net student Christina Madero, discussing America's issue with the lack of minority students in the field of math and science. Thank you again for being with us today, Christina.
Very happy to be here.
So earlier we were discussing your personal experience and journey up to your collegiate pre-med career, and you stated earlier that there has been unique challenges you have faced as a minority student. Given your situation, how do you feel about America's current situation with other minority students that may be going through the same situation that you're in?
With the American students, many of the minorities that are trying to pursue these upper-level career paths, they have a lot of obstacles to overcome. One of my favorite exercises that I did in high school was in government, where we would take a step forward every time we got something good and a step back every time we had a characteristic that was bad, and then at the end we would race. I started very far back. None of my parents went to college, as I said. And when we raced, I still got to the fence before a lot of the people. And what that was trying to show is that if you push hard enough, and it really is up to the individual, for each minority group to not only rally within yourselves, but with each other and push yourselves farther enough. And if America can accept that, I think we can definitely overcome this.
That is a wonderful inspiration for anyone who may be listening, that you can do it no matter what you look like. Thank you, Christina, for talking with us today. And Revolution listeners, if you all want to play a role in joining the movement to encourage America's minority students, take part in math and science. Telemundo and Blurds Incorporated are two companies raising awareness of the importance of math and science education amongst Latino and Black youth. More information can be found at telemundo.com and blacknerdmovement.com. Gandhi couldn't have said it any better. You may never know what results may come from your action, but if you do nothing, there will be no result. It's been a pleasure having you here, Christina, and thank you, listeners. From the School of Journalism and Broadcasting at Western Kentucky University, I'm Hattie Baji with today's Revolution 91.7 Platform Report, where we discuss problems and issues facing our everyday lives. As many universities nationwide are facing budget cuts, funding for various collegiate programs and courses is dwindling. Amongst such courses are the Women's and Gender Studies programs. The cuts are forcing the courses to be dropped, as the genre is repeatedly deemed not as important as other popular options. However, proponents argue that the studies provides better understandings of women's diverse contributions to society, along with examining the existence of equality amongst men and women. Fortunately, despite the issues facing support for the teachings, works from various modern scholars successfully embody the essence of these studies. With us today to discuss the influence of women's and gender studies on American society is University of Minnesota professor and author of the book, Building a Housewife's Paradise, Dr. Tracy Deutsch. Thank you for being with us today, Dr. Deutsch.
Thank you.
Now, given your present situation as a professor at the University of Minnesota and having many of your pieces published, you have, without a doubt, accomplished success. What is the history behind your career and your success?
Politics and economics has been the focus of my work and a lot of my thinking. I look at these through the lens of power relations and sort of try to put together the rewards and the authority that people get through unpaid work. I also have to, as a historian, go back to the beginning and say that comes from where I come from. I grew up in Chicago in a racially integrated public high school, but one where we were encouraged and in some ways forced to confront differences of race, class, and gender. And that really opened up the world for me and the questions that I asked about it. I had wonderful mentorship and teachers, and together that sort of propelled me forward in terms of my career, but also the kinds of questions that I asked.
So you say your mentors and your teachers were your great inspirations, and you are a history professor. Mm-hmm. Then you also have some sort of establishment in women and gender studies.
That's right.
What was the inspiration behind particularly going into this avenue?
I think I always understood that gender was an important category in my life and in the lives of many people, in the way that I think students continue to understand that, actually. Now we're often told it's a post-feminist world, but that many students that I encounter don't have the experience of a post-feminist world. What they experience is a world where gender continues to matter and continues to be a site of authority and also inequality.
What has gender studies, from what you have learned in gender studies, taught you as an individual?
Oh, quite a bit. There are basic frameworks that are helpful in terms of thinking about inequality between men and women. But more broadly than that, I think that gender studies does sort of epitomizes what the liberal arts do. They help you to think about the world that you live in and to apply your knowledge, your deep knowledge, in terms of social change or your everyday job. So, for instance, gender studies has helped me to think about the ways that these basic categories that we think of as natural are constructed. They come from somewhere. So once you think about things coming from somewhere, you can imagine the diversity of people and the diversity of histories we all bring to the world and all of the change that's possible.
So are there any interesting experiences, life experiences, you have applied this study to in your everyday life?
I think just in terms of the general charge not to take anything as given, right? I do that, and I try to do that in my everyday life, and to imagine, for instance, when I talk about the food distribution system, which is sometimes something I talk about a lot, I feel able to imagine all kinds of alternative food distribution systems that don't depend on any natural organization of people or families or identities. So I think it really broadens the possibilities.
Gender and women's studies is without a doubt still relevant, as you're seeing in today's society. It helps us examine the continued social and political experiences, especially those that affect women. Now, you're the driving force behind the Julia Child Project, which I thought was an interesting correlation because, from my understanding, you connect gender studies in some way to the career of the famous cook.
Right.
So what is this puzzling connection between food and gender studies here?
Julia Child is a wonderful figure for talking about gender and food because she's so surprising in some ways. She's famous, of course, as a powerful female figure in American life, and she was. But she was not somebody who was interested or believed that women naturally had affinities for each other. She would not have called herself a feminist, I don't think. But she was very articulate about the fact that she thought that her gender shouldn't hold her back in terms of her career. And because of that, I think she really encourages us to think about the ways that our ideas about women and food narrow possibilities for women. Even though we think of women as sort of central to cooking and food, we often have preconceived notions of what kind of work women do around food, and she challenges those notions.
That's an interesting connection. How did it all start? Like, what was the inspiration behind it? Were you just watching the movie or just...
It's not from the movie. It comes from two different places. So on the one hand, I wanted, in an intellectual way, I wanted to do a project that was very different from my first project, which was to zero in on a person's life and to follow it through. And my first project was a sort of big, sprawling study about grocery stores where I encountered lots of individuals who I couldn't really track through their lives. And I wanted a chance to do that. It had also raised some questions for me that I didn't get a chance to answer about the role of 1920s and 1930s gender history, which was a moment that really championed women's autonomy and professionalism. I was also interested in the 1950s and 1960s and the Cold War and its effects on food and the workings of class in American life. And Julia Child's life was perfectly positioned to get at those things. She really brings those together. So that's the intellectual reason. Okay. But I would be lying if I said that the reason I went at this project was solely intellectual. As a scholar more invested and engaged in food studies, I noticed how many news stories and policy debates and geopolitical summits and casual conversations with my friends were about food. And one day I just thought, how did this happen? Why did food come to occupy such a politically prominent position in the life of this country and also in my personal life? And again, I think Julia Child's life and her emphasis on careful, effortful, laborious cooking helps us to examine those questions. I want to know what her world was like and how it was different from the world we live in now.
Well, that's really cool to think about, you know, her connection to our society. The project itself, have you seen any significant impact or experiences with the project since it has started?
I've just started to present about some of my research, and I'm struck by how often I encounter people who feel a personal attachment to Julia Child, both academics and non-academics, who continue to say that she taught them, quote unquote, how to cook. And they are often very interested in how her life intersected with systems that we might not usually connect her life to, right? Things like foreign policy or gender relations or ideas about domesticity that were changing in the 1960s and 70s. So I'm really struck by the interest in Julia Child and the willingness to imagine her in different ways.
You've gotten some great reactions. Any puzzling feedback that you've got from it?
The feedback that I've gotten has often been people surprised that I came to this project without myself being a gourmet cook.
Great.
People often assume or hope that I'll learn how to cook her recipes. And I cook at home like most of us, but I certainly wouldn't call myself surprised that I could come to this without coming at it through food.
Wow.
Or through that kind of cooking.
Thank you for speaking with us. After the break, Dr. Deutsch is going to give us the Beyond the Page commentary on her book, Building a Housewife's Paradise, and also its discourse on gender studies. Welcome back to Revolution, listeners. I'm Hattie Baji with Dr. Deutsch, University of Minnesota history professor and author of the book, Building a Housewife's Paradise. Thank you again for being with us today.
Thank you.
So earlier in the show, we were discussing the elements of gender studies and social studies through the Julia Childs Project, what impact it had. Adding on to this discussion, your book also provides some analysis into gender studies. Could you explain the general argument or theme you address in your book?
Yeah. So in Building a Housewife's Paradise, I was interested in the politics of food shopping at the moment leading up to supermarket. And what I was struck by were two separate but intersecting changes. One was that women continued to feel responsible, as far as I can tell, for most families' shopping and food provisioning, and to put a lot of effort and work into it. It was definitely something that required planning. Even as supermarkets emerged and we think of this very streamlined, systematized world, it still required a lot of work to navigate. Mm-hmm. So that's one change. But the other one is this emergence of an idea that these stores had been built to satisfy women, and that women were satisfied in these stores, and that it made shopping into an easy, almost mindless process, that it made shopping into a pleasure. So on the one hand, you have a reality of the labor and the thought that goes into food shopping. On the other hand, you have a rhetoric of women as sort of happily satisfied, mindless creatures who are shopping in stores. And both critics of mass consumption and supporters of mass retailing supermarkets adopt this idea that stores work when women don't put in any effort. And I think that criteria for when a system of distribution works continues to inform the way we think about food shopping. That if it's a lot of work to shop, we need to redo retailing, or that people won't take to it, without thinking about what's happening as labor and work. So my conclusions were in some ways about women's history, but more broadly, I think my conclusions were about the ways that ideas about women and ideas about gender inform our whole ideas about consumption.
Wow.
And supermarkets.
So you're also a historian,
I am.
a teacher. Have you ever realized a shift in history from the way that those roles changed? Has the role changed since maybe in the 80s or the 90s to now, in terms of shopping or the way that the stores set up their infrastructure?
Certainly retail has changed, and probably the way households divide up the effort of shopping has changed. What I have noticed is, in general, more inequality, more divisions in terms of how people shop and where they shop. So now there's grocery stores that are targeted to micro demographics or much smaller parts of the population. There's increasing inequality in terms of food, just like there is in everything else. And large mass market chain stores, that sort of model we have, are having, in some ways, a tougher time than they did during the years that I studied in the 50s and 60s.
From the process of writing your book, what were the inspirations or the elements that truly helped you get this message across in the way that you wanted it to the audience?
Well, I have to give a shout out to my family, who was very understanding and supportive as I worked it all out. Also, it was the voices that I was reading. You know, it was that encouragement that I got from my mentors and then from my colleagues to pay attention to what the sources were telling me and not to the images we already had about supermarkets. So just sort of paying attention to my own experience and what I was seeing made an enormous difference in what I was able to find.
And it seems like even from Julia Child, in some way that this can connect your book. What is that connection?
The most obvious connection is that I wanted to look at what people did with food once they got it home. So my first book was about shopping, and then I realized, I wonder what happened when they left the store. The Julia Child Project is a way into that world. How cooking and domestic labor was worked out and occupied a way of performing class and gender in the 1960s and 1970s. So that's one connection. But she's also a window onto the kinds of foods people could get at stores and how that has changed over time, which has been really interesting to me.
Well, that's a very interesting look into society and look into the effects of our domestication of women's studies. And definitely, even from our conversation today, we realize that this is a wonderful element for society to realize.
Actually, the University of Kentucky just started a PhD program in women's and gender studies. And it's an example, I think, of how support for these programs is growing in some places. Largely, I think, because they fulfill a lot of needs of students. I know at Minnesota, gender and women's studies classes are full. There's a lot of interest, even not in gender and women's classes, in gender and ideas about gender and men and women. I think that students who take the classes often find that they help them, not just in terms of thinking about inequality between men and women, but in using critical thinking skills and thinking about the world that they inhabit in broader ways, and applying those across the disciplines, which is what an interdiscipline like gender and women's studies can do. And I also, one thing that's easy to miss is that there are not a lot of programs that grant PhDs in gender and women's studies, but there are quite a few, and there's a lot of demand, actually, for PhDs from those programs.
Special thank you again for speaking with us today. And thank you, listeners, for tuning in to today's show. For those of you wanting more insight into the discussion, take a look into Dr. Deutsch's book, available in bookstores and online. For Revolution 91.7, I'm Hattie Baji.